Welcome everyone to another exciting episode of Curtains Up, where we dive deep into the history and evolution of theater. Today, we're traveling back to the Middle Ages to explore the fascinating world of medieval theater, its religious roots, traveling troupes, and the spectacular pageantry that shaped the stage as we know it. Joining us for this journey is an incredibly special guest, Professor Carol Symes, a distinguished professor of history at the University of Illinois and a professional actor herself. With a unique blend of academic expertise and first-hand performance experience, she brings a rich perspective on how medieval theater bridged faith, storytelling, and the performing arts. Professor Symes, please introduce yourself to the audience.
Thank you so much. Wow, it's such a delight to be here. I think you did a wonderful job setting up the topic of our discussion today and my interest in it, both as a theater practitioner and as a scholar, and as somebody who regularly teaches medieval theater to my undergraduate and graduate students. So it's a real special pleasure to get to meet a theater aficionado like yourself.
It's awesome. I just find the history of theater so fascinating, and I just want to really dive deep onto how it affected history itself and how it's evolved into where it is today. I just find it so fascinating. So thank you for being here.
Yeah.
And let's start off. Let's set the stage both literally and figuratively for medieval theater. Could you give us an overview of the cultural and social conditions in medieval Europe? Like, how did the factors of the dominance of the church, feudalism, and the daily lives of people shape the kinds of performances that emerged during this period?
Thanks. Yeah, thanks. It's a great question. I think the most important thing to understand about medieval theater is that it was community theater. Plays and other performances throughout medieval Europe emerge from the core questions that a given group of people is asking about itself, its identity, its place in the world, its relationship to the divine, its relationship to the supernatural world as well as the natural world. The Middle Ages was a world without purpose-built theaters. So one of the things that really distinguishes medieval theater from the theater of Greco-Roman antiquity was that was state-sponsored theater for the most part, or patron-sponsored theater. So patrons and individual states, whether it be a city-state like Athens or the Roman imperial government, had a lot of control over what occurred in a theater. But in the Middle Ages, we have no buildings called theater, which means that theater can happen anywhere and did happen anywhere. It can happen in the street, it can happen in a church, it can happen in a royal court, it can happen in the courtyard of an inn when you're stopping by for a drink at the end of a long journey. It can happen in a monastery. So medieval theater is very varied. The other thing that lends itself to that is medieval Europe is a radically decentralized place politically. After the fragmentation of Roman imperial power in Western Europe in particular, the eastern part of the Roman Empire is a different story. But in most of Europe, for many hundreds of years, we don't have any kind of centralized political authority. And this is actually very good for actors and very good for performers, because it means that there are multiple entities, whether they're princes or barbarian kings or monasteries, that are wanting to use performance to enhance their own reputations, to tell the stories that they want to tell about their own power or about their place in the world. So we could say that theater is thriving. But the other thing we have to keep in mind is that this is also a period of time when theater tends not to be scripted. So among the many things that I've spent my career writing about is the difficulty of recovering medieval theatricality, Rohan, because performers have no other safeguard they have no copyright law. They have no way of making sure that their material isn't stolen by somebody else. So for the most part, performers learn their craft from other performers. And I mean this both for itinerant minstrels and professional acting troupes that travel around, but this is also the true for monastic performers as well. Most people enter monasteries, which were powerhouses of theatrical production in the medieval period. Most people enter monasteries as children, and they grow up with the liturgy, they grow up with an understanding of what monastic theater involves, and so we rarely have scripts for many of the kinds of theater that would have been performed in the Middle Ages because people just didn't need them. So that gives, for us as historians of theater, that creates a little bit of a challenge, right? Because if we don't have a ton of texts, we have to be really creative and imaginative when we approach the sources that we do have for theater. We can't be expecting to find really elaborate. We often don't even find what people said to one another. So I think we have to think about medieval theater often as like devised theater or sketch theater. Think about Saturday Night Live. How hard
So
it
would
was.
you say that improv was heavy here?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Huge part of a huge, I mean, I think improv is a huge part of any culture's theatrical
Yeah,
tradition.
that's true.
This would have been true in antiquity as well. And in fact, in antiquity, we tend to know about the kinds of theater that people disapproved of from critiques of theater. Like we know a lot about what Aristotle didn't like about theater because he wrote about it, right? And often we have to reconstruct the funniest and the edgiest and the most politically subversive kind of theater. We have to reconstruct that from what the critics said about it and why they didn't like it. So again, imagine we had no scripts of SNL. Imagine what,
Yeah, and we're just reconstructing from
SNL.
what critics said. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
you
like
would,
what I'm getting is that during this time frame, which is the dark age of theater, medieval time frame.
so
Yeah, there wasn't really much to be like recorded. Like yes, the liturgical dramas they did they were what most people came to watch, and that's what how drama continued to survive. But in terms of things that were recorded for history, those didn't really show up much, right? It was really hard to
yeah,
have documented history.
I think that one of the things that is implicit in your questions is the role of the medieval church, the Roman Church, which certainly had an extremely important, it was
There's a
preserved the
huge
Latin.
impact on theater.
I mean, it preserves the Latin language
Yeah.
as a language of learning and a language of worship. But if we have people performing in their local vernaculars, the vernacular languages of Europe, so French, German, Italian, those don't become written literary languages until the end of the 11th or 12th century. So, but we shouldn't assume from that there were no people performing in those languages. Of course there were. It's just that they had no interest in, or maybe no aptitude to write them down. It is the case that most of the scripts that we have for medieval theater are, as you said, liturgical, what are often called liturgical plays, plays that emerge out of mostly monastic ritual life. But even the scripts that we have are just a fraction of the many. I mean, every monastery would have had its own theatrical tradition, and we maybe know about a dozen of them. I mean, out of hundreds of thousands of medieval monastic communities, we have like tiny amount of material. So what we have to imagine is when we're looking at the scripted evidence from medieval theater, we're looking at the tiny tip of a ginormous iceberg of theatrical activity, which spans everything
The
from
entirety of like
the
the period
entirety of
from
everything.
400 to 1600. Yeah.
For a
That
thousand
huge
years.
blank gap. Yep.
Yeah, exactly. And I
And
think
then this is actually interesting because I had another question about like how the church influenced medieval theater both positively and negatively, and I was
sure.
wondering if you could tie those into this discussion we were just having.
Yeah, well, and this is back to what we were saying about critics.
Yeah.
So, one of the best ways to gauge the popularity and indeed political and social salience of medieval theater is the many, mostly clerical writers who didn't like it. And it's precisely because it was so powerful and so good that they didn't like it. But we can't make the mistake of just assuming that because a bunch of curmudgeonly people didn't like theater, that meant that they were able to shut it down. They weren't. They just were curmudgeon. They were just, they just didn't
They
like it.
tried their best, but they couldn't. Yeah.
Exactly. Some people might have tried their best to do it, but I should also say that there were many people within the church. Most of the critiques of medieval theatricality are coming from clerical elites angry at other clerical elites for having really vibrant theater traditions. So it's really what we're witnessing is kind of a power struggle over who is going to control the entertainment environment, and I mean entertainment can be sacred worshipful entertainment can be edgy comedy entertainment.
Yeah.
What we're really witnessing there is not an effort to shut down theater, which would be impossible anyway, but an effort to negotiate who is going to control that entertainment environment and what gets performed in that entertainment environment. But back to what I said, because medieval power is so decentralized for much of the period, no one entity, including the Pope, has the power to. I mean, medieval governments maybe would have loved to have the power to censor things, but they just didn't have that power. I mean, it was just impossible. So we have to take all of the critiques of medieval theatricality with the grain of salt that they deserve, because what they're really bearing witness to is not the effective control of theater, but anxiety about how powerful theater is.
And how
And
powerful that message they're sending is, and how the audience can react to those messages, right?
totally, totally. And this, and I should also, but I also want to emphasize that the religious drama, the liturgical plays that we do have are themselves often really funny, really edgy, employ fascinating theatrical effects. Often, for example, the one of the oldest written examples of Middle High German, the German vernacular, comes from a religious play. It comes from a play about the Passion of Jesus, where the character of Mary Magdalene sings and speaks in the vernacular, which is a way of showing that this character of Mary Magdalene, who again is an edgy character, she's allegedly a sex worker, but she's also a disciple of Jesus, in this Latin drama, she is the one speaking directly to the people in the audience in their own language. So even if a play is being produced by a monastery and is about very sacred subjects, it's not like it's devoid of it's not devoid of comedy. It's not like it's devoid of political commentary. It's not like it's devoid of even sexiness, right? Because this Mary character is very sexy. So I think we have to, so much of our attitude toward the medieval church tends to get filtered through a sort of 16th century Protestant idea of the church as a very restricted and controlling entity. And that's a very, I don't know, just a very flimsy, one-dimensional idea of what
Of how we should stop theater. It's a bad idea, and not appreciating the messages they're sending out. Yeah.
Exactly.
And it's just like, it's so unique to me how even after the Roman Church and the Protestants, they tried their best to shut down drama and succeeded for a little bit. Like the Roman dramas that were at the time at the commonplace with the gladiator stuff, those were the boat entertainments. For a time, drama did disappear for a little bit, and it was revived eventually by the Roman Church. But
I would say that drama never really disappeared, and in fact, much of the most interesting scholarship now on early Christianity is about how the Gospels and themselves grew out of a theatrical tradition. So the disappearance, for example, you're absolutely right, that early Christian apologists disliked Roman theater, and especially the Roman theater of cruelty, precisely because Christians were the object of that theater of cruelty.
Yeah, and they wanted to shut it down.
It's not surprising that if you're seeing your friends getting murdered because they're Christians, you're not like a big fan of this regime. But it is not correct to think that there weren't that Christians themselves didn't have their own. In fact, Christians are always complaining again that so-and-so is too theatrical. Like there's a famous 4th century bishop, St. John Chrysostom, who's called Chrysostom because it means golden mouth. He's such a great preacher. He's such a great performer. Everybody wants to go to his sermons. So there are tons of other people like complaining this guy's too theatrical. So even if early Christians were uncomfortable with the pagan theater of Rome, which was directly opposed to their religious beliefs, they still had their own type of drama. The other thing I want to say, and you also asked this great question, what are the good things about the medieval church? We would not have any ancient Roman or Greek drama to study at all if it had not been for medieval scribes. The only reason we have the scripts of the great tragedians of Athens and of Aristophanes, we only have those whole scripts because they were copied by monks in Byzantium, in the Eastern Roman Empire. So we would have no ancient drama to study if it had not been for the medieval church. And I think it's so important to remind my friends and colleagues in the classics that that it's because of medieval scribes and scholars who continue to, even if these Greek tragedies were never performed in the way that they would have been in Athens, they were still read aloud, they were taught in schools, they were enjoyed by, anybody, in the case of the Greek-speaking world, anybody with a basic Greek education would know these plays very well. So this narrative of the Christian suppression of ancient drama is essentially a false narrative, and I think proven that quite conclusively in some of my scholarship. But I don't want to pretend that everybody was super psyched about this. As I said, there are plenty of people like Tertullian, who's a 2nd century Greek-speaking Christian in the Roman world. He's not happy with, the perpetuation of Roman drama. Yeah.
That's okay. That is a really good.
And just as in our own time, I think that there's anybody can have a range of opinion about whether they like a given type of theater or not, right? Not everybody has the same theatrical tastes. And I think we just have to keep that in mind when we read the critics of a particular period, to not give them more power than they actually had.
Yeah, no, that's a really good thought, and I really like on your take on how that drama never really disappeared. It's just that like various different people have various different dislikes, and it's just really interesting how you said that like the critics, they don't have all the power, but at the time they probably did, right? Like they had some power
Well,
over
I mean,
how the
this
audience
guy,
thought
this
of
guy
it.
Tertullian, this guy Tertullian, he had a lot of influence over later Christians as an early Christian teacher, but he was living in Carthage during a time of massive persecution of Christians, so he actually had very little
Okay.
power. So, and there's good work by scholars, including myself, on almost the negative discourse around theater that emerges among early Christians. Absolutely, we have a negative kind of discourse, but we shouldn't make the mistake of believing that that discourse is more. Look, I mean, you as a lover of theater is a powerful force. Theater is a human need. Human beings need to tell stories through performance. It's one of the ways that makes us human. And so even in times of great distress, even in times of crisis, as we see at the end of toward the end of imperial power in Western Europe, there's often a discourse around that crisis, but it's never going to be powerful enough to shut down people's need and desire to tell stories and to enact them.
And this is actually a really good segue to one of my final questions, which is what elements of medieval theater are still visible in modern performance traditions? Like, how do you think the past affects the future?
That's a great question. So I'll answer this in two ways. First, one of the most important playwright in the English language tradition, William Shakespeare, is a medieval dramatist. Shakespeare emerged, as a child. The great religious cycle plays of later medieval England were still being performed in his lifetime. So we tend to think of Shakespeare as a Renaissance or an early modern playwright, and in some sense he is, because he's returning to classical models often in his structuring of his plays, but he is emerging out of a rich medieval theatrical tradition. So we can tell a story about medieval theater that is not a story of rupture, but is actual story of how plot lines, characters, tropes that were carried forward from medieval performance traditions into the theater of Shakespeare, which is the sort of first professional theater of the English-speaking world. So, for example, in Richard III, Shakespeare basically takes a devil character that shows up in late medieval morality plays and turns that into this English king. So Richard III is essentially a medieval allegorical character in this play. So that's one way. We can talk about continuities in the way that playwrights of the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries were still reshaping medieval material. But we can also talk about rupture and recovery, because it is true that I said, medieval European theater is a theater without walls. It's a theater without buildings. What starts to happen in the 16th century is the enclosure of theater. In fact, for me, the story of real repression for theater is not a story about the 2nd century or the 4th century. It's a story about the 16th century. Because Protestants and Catholics both want to show that they can control the public sphere. And so whether you're living in a Catholic state or a Protestant state, the state has now a vested interest in, if not censoring what you perform, at least you have to get a license for it. So playwrights in Shakespeare's England have to have a license for everything they put on. They have to have an enclosed space. They have to charge money. Medieval theater was often paid for by the performers, or if they were professional actors, itinerant performers, they would pass the hat, but they would do so in the course of performance. You wouldn't actually have to pay money to get into the building. So for me, the story about the early modern period is the story about the severe restriction of what is capable of being theater because of the increased power of states to control what people see. So I actually, if I were going to tell a story of theater, I'd say that the real dark age of theater is the 16th century, and that we really only emerged from that dark age in the 20th century when Bertolt Brecht and other really revolutionary theater performers are like, Theater should no longer be a capitalist enterprise. Theater should no longer be controlled by the state. We're going to take it out to the streets. We're gonna break the fourth wall.
We're gonna move it everywhere. We're gonna
medieval theater
make
had no fourth wall. So for me, the real black hole of theater is the invention of the proscenium arch, the enclosed theater building, theater as a capitalist commercial enterprise, theater as a place where the audience is acculturated to be quiet and sit in the dark and just let people talk to them. It's not interactive anymore. So I think that period, 1700 to like 1900, that's the bad period of theater. That's where theater becomes boring, dull, capitalist, commercial.
Like, kind of like keeping on repeating itself, not really sending a message.
And it's the tool of the state. It's the tool of the. So I know this is not a narrative of theater that most people would accept, but if what you value about theater, as I do, is the constant interplay between actor and audience, the porousness of the performing space, the capacity for theater to happen anywhere, the capacity for theater to be a critique of and check on power, speaking truth to power, that is not the theater of the modern period. That is the theater of the medieval period. It's the theater of the postmodern period after Brecht, but it's not the theater of the so-called Enlightenment.
Yeah. Okay, that's all my questions. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast and answering them.
Thank you so much for your great questions and for giving me a chance to talk about my favorite topic.
Yeah, no problem. I really hope you had a great time, and I hope you as the audience members had an awesome time listening to us talk. As always, we'll be uploading more videos soon, so just keep on checking and follow our Instagram. And thank you, Professor Symes.
Thanks.